And joining us now in studio, Adam Gopnik, author of The Table Comes First, Family, France, and the Meaning of Food, and staff writer at The New Yorker. Hello again.
Pleasure to be back.
Okay, so yesterday we talked about food in Paris and the French Revolution a little bit, and today I want to start off by talking about the 21st century food revolution that's happening. So a few years ago, most infamously, Jamie Oliver, TV chef, introduces this idea of a food revolution, that we need to have better ingredients, eat better, see better quality food. What do you think of that idea of a food revolution?
Well, listen, I am a participant in it, a foot soldier with a pike on my shoulder in that revolution. When I come home to New York and I'll open the cupboard and I see that someone has smuggled Honey Nut Cheerios into our house, and I'll go as mad as any Jacobin and say, who brought these in? Who bought these? We don't have this kind of thing in this household. And I will thrust organic broccoli on my children and so on. So I fully participate in it. Those are my tastes. I also, as somebody who reads history, I have enough insight, I hope, to know that this will change. In other words, that the food revolution we're living through now, admirable though many of its principles are, necessary though its thoughts on sustainability may well be for the planet, nonetheless is a moment in the great whirligig of fashion. We feel passionately about these things because food becomes for us very powerful and available symbols of our values. And the point I try to make in The Table Comes First is that our food choices in that way are as much symbolic choices as they are, in a sense, sustainable choices. We're showing who we want to be as much as we're actually taking actions that will save the planet. As you probably know, the arguments about localism, for instance, the idea that you should only eat within a food shed of 100 miles or 200 miles or so on, much easier to do in California, I might add, than in Northern Ontario. Nonetheless, there are lots of arguments about whether or not it's not better for the planet in some way to ship our lamb in from New Zealand, where you can raise lamb much more cheaply, even if you use up carbon miles by sending it here. Lots of arguments, hard to settle, and we need to take them seriously. What is certain, though, is that if we eat the lamb grown in the backyard of our neighbor, we're putting a face on our food. We're reconnecting ourselves to the whole cycle of food production rather than letting our kids simply think that, as my friend Fergus Henderson, the British chef, says, meat is pink in plastic, right? That it's just pink stuff that appears in plastic. That's valuable, even if it costs us a little more, even if it's not actually saving the planet. As my own experiment in local eating, as my own experiment in bathing, not just tickling my toes in the waters of the food revolution, but getting fully immersed in it, I decided that we would spend a week eating food, only food, that had been raised or grown in the 5 boroughs of New York City, which sets a very high standard of difficulty. And indeed, there are 2 farms in New York. One of them is fertilized with manure taken from the Bronx Zoo, elephant manure taken from the Bronx Zoo. They say you can taste the difference in Asian and African elephant dung. I think
really?
They may have been teasing me. And the hard thing to find in New York, of course, is protein. You can find vegetables and herbs and so on. So I had to arrange for a chicken to be whacked, like on The Sopranos, surreptitiously at an egg-growing garden up in the Bronx. And at the last minute, the guy wouldn't do it. He had a conscience. He wouldn't whack the chicken. So we went to the Bronx, and we found a slaughterhouse, and we got a chicken killed on the spot. Unfortunately, it wasn't a New York raised chicken. It was a Pennsylvania raised chicken. But I thought, look, it's had a brief life. It's lived in 2 crowded quarters, and it died in an act of random violence from a stranger. That counts as a New York chicken. That is a New York chicken. And we got tilapia raised at Brooklyn College, all of those things. It was a sort of partly a kind of satiric exercise in making fun of a new manner. But it was also a serious attempt to see if I could do it. And finally, the point was that there was a great joy in going around and having Staten Island green peppers and Brooklyn College tilapia and a poor Pennsylvania chicken killed in the Bronx. The kids saw it, my kids saw it, I saw it, and it put a face on our food. It connected us to our lives. We were talking last night, right, about how much of our lives have become simply exercises in abstracted pixels. When you're engaged in the process of connecting to your food, there's nothing abstract about it.
Is that the reason why we're seeing it now? I mean, you know, timing's everything. Are all the ingredients ripe to make this food movement apropos now?
Yeah, I think so. For the reason we were talking about last night. I think part of it is we're health conscious. There's no doubt about that. Part of it is we're green conscious, right? We want to make choices that don't destroy the planet too badly. We're aware, and partly we're, I hope, more and more compassionate. We know what the industrial abattoir, the industrial slaughterhouse does to the animals that are raised within it. All of those are very positive and in the best sense, progressive things. But as I said before, you can never eliminate the symbolic dimension of human behavior. Everything we do, even when we believe it's good, also has a symbolic function. And one of the powerful symbols we send when we invite people over for dinner, and it takes 2.5 hours instead of 20 minutes, when we say, oh, I sourced my chicken in the Bronx rather than in the supermarket, we say, we care about these things, and we care about reasserting the material basis, if you like, of our lives. And that's important.
You know, you keep saying we, but really this is, I mean, there is some of this revolution idea, this food revolution going on in Europe, but it really is a North American we that you're talking about. Is there a reason for that?
Well, North Americans, people in the United States especially, Canadians too, tend to be highly moralizing people. We are very uncomfortable with anything that doesn't have a moral attached to it. We like a moral attached to our art. We're not frivolous in quite that way. I think that's part of it. Another thing that I think is interesting is that we use food as a political symbol in a much more transparent way than happens in Europe. If I'm on the road, which I am a lot, and I go into somebody's house, they invite me over for dinner, and they offer me a raw, organic, locally sourced carrot with a little bit of fleur de sel, I know everything about those people's politics in a second. I know how much money they gave to Obama last time, how much less they'll give this time, and so on.
You know how much money they make as well.
And you know how much money they make. You know that they're not the peasants. Even if they're serving you peasant food, the one thing you know for certain is they ain't the peasants. But if I go to France and I get the same thing, it's perfectly possible, you know, that that organic carrot might be coming to me from somebody who's with the National Front, because they're emphasizing, asserting the primacy of the French soil, the French terroir, over all the invasions of the aliens. So we use our food as not a weapon so much, but as a political symbol with a clarity that I don't think takes place in Europe.
You use the phrase, the difference between our mouth tastes and our moral tastes. Is that what you mean, that we've made food into something much bigger than just mouth taste? That
maybe is the most important sort of distinction, idea that's in the table comes first. That is that you can never separate mouth taste and moral taste. The mouth taste is what tickles or delights or heats up our palate, and the moral taste are the values that we associate with it. Everyone does it throughout the history of mankind. That's why we have religious diets. That's why Jewish people won't eat pork and Muslim people won't eat pork, and you have to slaughter animals certain ways. Those are moral tastes, primarily. But we do it more and more now, and never more than we do now, so that sort of everything that you do has a moral taste associated with it. I went to Barcelona in the course of writing this book, where the madmen, the Willy Wonkas of modern cooking live, molecular cuisine guys. And at one level, they're magicians. They're playing with things. And another level, they see themselves, their moral taste is that food should be art. It should have the expressive and emotional power that a great work of art does. That's another kind of moral taste. It's not moralistic in the same way, but it means I'm not just serving you food that's delicious, I'm serving you something that is deeply meaningful. So you can't separate mouth taste and moral taste, and you shouldn't try. All you can do is be aware of what the moral taste is that the mouth taste suggests, and ask yourself where it came from.
You make another connection in the book that I found so interesting. This is the idea of music and how it plays into our idea of how we eat, who it is that's eating these things. So talk to me a little bit more about how music plays a role.
Well, I have a couple of different ways of seeing it. One of my little musical sections is about, because I love music and it's my great passion, other than cooking, and is that Keith Richards, a great Rolling Stones guitar player, is one of my heroes. I know it seems unlikely, Gopnik Richards, but he's my hero. And he has a beautiful section in his book. You know, he wrote My Life, which is the women and the heroin and more heroin and Mick Jagger and all of that. But what's the thing he writes about with real zing? He writes his recipes for sausage and bangers, for bangers and mash, and for shepherd's pie. And he has a beautiful section about why, you know, he plays with this very special tuning, open G tuning. He says, why is it wonderful? It's because there's always the same note buzzing underneath it. And I thought that was a real insight into what makes any great dish great. And I was thinking particularly of rice pudding, which is one of the things I love most. You know, every people, pretty much, in the world has a rice pudding that they use as a sacred or semi-sacred dish. Rites of passage, weddings, funerals, you serve sweetened rice of some kind. And that fascinated me, and I realized rice is sort of like open G tuning. It runs right throughout the world, and we each play a little variation on it. So how's that for a metaphysical connection?
I just want to stay with the Keith Richards theme, because I heard you in a talk saying that you wake up every morning and listen to Keith Richards, listen to a Rolling Stone song. Is that true?
That is absolutely true. I write all day, 6-7 hours a day with rock on, with the rock of my youth, which happened to be the greatest rock ever made, just by chance, but it was. And I either hear the Stones from '69 playing Gimme Shelter or Jumpin' Jack Flash, Keith Richards, Mick Taylor Stones, or I play Eric Clapton's Derek and the Dominos. And so the kids know that I've started work because suddenly I press the button and it blares throughout the house.
A nice touch. Okay, back to food. I want to, you have a chapter in here called Meat versus Vegetables, and we all know that animal rights groups are really at the fore. There's posters about murdering chickens at the Toronto public transit system. And I'm wondering, how have ethical questions about meat really changed the food culture in North America?
Good. Big question. In writing this book, I have, like I think many of us, very conflicted, ambivalent feelings about meat eating. On the one hand, if anything is natural for primates, meat eating is. We were, in a certain sense, designed to do it. At the same time, we all recognize the cruelty of so much industrial animal production, the cruelty involved in treating creatures that may not have fully conscious minds, but certainly have the capacity for suffering as though they were objects. We want to escape that. Terribly tortured questions. At the same time, I think we all know that there's a difference between eating a pork chop and sending someone to a concentration camp, and we have to make moral distinctions of that kind too. So what I tried to do in the chapter about meat eating in this book was to do the best I could to walk my way around the subject, to say, what are the arguments? Where can we find place? And finally, what I concluded, or at least sort of provisionally, is that, look, nobody has any problems with the notion of scavenging. If we find a thing dead already, do we have a problem with eating it? I don't think so, any more than we have problems with recycling our own body parts to help other people. So that shows us that the problem isn't really killing animals, if we can do it humanely. The problem is, do they suffer in their lives? And that's the real issue. It's not so much about our right to take the life of animals, I think. It's about our right to inflict pain on them while they're alive, and the pain of being a veal cooped up, a veal calf cooped up in a tiny shed, or a pig, such an intelligent animal, even being aware of its imminent demise. Pigs are smart. They know, they get frightened, like as dogs do. Those, I think, are the real questions. And there's no question, I think, Piya, that to solve those moral problems, there's one thing is certain to happen. The price of meat, the price of protein is bound to go up. But that's no bad thing. Eating less of it in order to do less harm, that seems to me a reasonable compact we can make.
You mentioned earlier about Fergus Henderson. What's his take on the morality of eating meat?
Fergus has a take that's so conceptually smart, it's almost like vegetarianism. He says we have to eat the whole beast, the whole carcass. If you're going to engage in the morally aggressive act of killing an animal, then you have to be prepared to eat the whole animal, honor the whole animal. You eat the hooves, you eat the ears, you eat the nose, you turn the face into face bacon, you eat the spleen and the heart and the kidneys, all of them delicious, if you want to eat the chops and the fillet. And he believes in whole beast eating, which is why my wife will never go to his restaurant. And I think that that is an admirably moral position, which, as I say, is so extreme that it's almost a form of vegetarianism. It says you can't make a casual commitment to being a carnivore. You have to make an all-out commitment to it to honor the beast that you eat. How the beasts feel about it is a whole other question. But I love the ethical rigor of his approach.
We have a restaurant, or had a restaurant in Toronto that was served all parts of the animal, and absolutely. It was a big trendy hit. I don't know how it's doing anymore. We've talked a lot about eating and gathering outside the restaurant. We talked about recipes at home. But people tend to go out now and eat, to gather for that meal, to linger over that meal. We don't tend to do it as much at home, except for on Thanksgiving and Christmas and other such celebratory occasions. Why do you think that is?
Well, we live very stressed lives. We live very stressed lives. One of the things I didn't want to do in this book was, though I'm evangelical about recipes I love and thinking about food in certain ways, one of the things I didn't want to do was to condescend to people who eat fast food. Right? Because the truth is that we force people into lives, especially in the United States, of enormous stress with very little time off, with both parents working. And the release of going to a McDonald's, I completely understand and empathize with. And anybody who takes a morally superior attitude towards it has never worked a full day in their life. At the same time, I think you can see all of the bad things that fast food represents for agriculture and for our health and for the symbols of food. And I do believe that we can all cook better and more simply, that it's easier to make a 20-minute spaghetti carbonara for your family than it is to take them to Burger King. So I believe in home-cooked meals, and I believe that they're available and there to be done. But we force people into lives of incredible time pressure now. You know, in fact, somebody once said, I think it was me, that 200 years ago in 1780, the most expensive thing in our diet was protein, and now the most expensive thing in our diet is time. And that's why when you go to a good restaurant, what's the one thing they ask of you, one thing they offer you, is time away, time away. And that's why our 3-star meals expand in the time they take, even as our normal meals contract.
It is difficult to have any conversation these days without talking about the role of the internet and how it's, you know, had an impact on our lives, how it's changed. How has the internet changed food?
Well, you know, media generally have a very strange relation to food, right? Because you can't taste anything, you can't smell anything on the internet or on cable television when they're cooking away. At the same time, it's broken down the recipe book in ways that are, I suppose, alarming to people who write them, though beneficial to those of us who use them. Because I was just thinking now, when I get home tonight, I want to make wild salmon with mustard sauce. Thought that'd be a good thing to make tonight. Think, do I have a good mustard sauce recipe? And as soon as I leave here, I'm going to go on my iPhone and Google salmon with mustard sauce, right? I'll be able to find it. So that is everything with the internet. Makes everything speedier, and then there's the whole restaurant thing. I happen to hate, now I will be a little unorthodox here. I hate the whole kind of Zagat's, Yelp, everybody reviews the restaurant. I find that kind of chorus of yelping voices with everybody giving their opinion, even if in the aggregate it's right. Restaurant criticism in its great days was a form of literature. It was a form of satire. It was a form of romantic literature. The guy Robert Courtine I mentioned last night was like that. And I hate seeing that kind of good writing about restaurants drowned in this clamor and chorus of undifferentiated voices.
And I suppose the idea that you're going to go now look up a recipe on your smartphone as soon as you walk out of here can also speak to the isolation that we're now seeing. People aren't gathering as much, and often when they do, you know, you go to a restaurant, you see 4 people sitting around a table, and that sort of traditional idea of talking to each other has given way to...
3 of them are texting. Yeah. 3 of them are texting. Isn't it the most absurd thing that you could possibly do? We make a rule in our family, at our test, that, you know, it's like leaving your guns in the poker table, right, in the Old West. Everybody leaves their iPhone outside, and I'm chief offender among them, right? I'm like a little itchy, right? I'm supposed to be getting an email from my editor. It's a sickness, and you do see it. But that's why we come back to the table. That's why it matters so much, because it is release.
We talked a little bit about food shows and the revolution that, you know, we have food channels everywhere. We're also seeing, though, more contemporary stories commonly featuring characters cooking or eating, if you think of James Bond in Casino Royale. Why do you think we're seeing food playing more of a role in the characters we're seeing?
In fiction and in the movies? I think a couple of reasons. One is that there is an element in which we envy good food and we see it on television as something. The other reason in good literature, I think, is that every era needs an activity that can be a kind of background activity, right? If you read 19th century novels, people are always taking long walks in the country, and they're thinking or they're talking about the actions of the novel then. We use cooking in that way. That's why cooking is at the forefront of so many contemporary novels, I think, because it's our natural sort of place to form a stream of consciousness. It's the rock bed against which we form the stream of consciousness. We find it totally credible that the hero or heroine of any contemporary novel would be cooking while they're thinking about whether to commit adultery or not. In the 19th century, they had to be taking a long walk while they considered it. Probably in early 20th century literature, they were driving a car when they considered it. Food is our common activity, and therefore we plant our common recreations and moral choices against it.
My mother always says, when did food get so trendy? I've been doing it for a long time.
Exactly.
We have about 5 minutes left, and I want to spend the last minutes of our conversation talking about you as a Canadian. I know you've lived in New York for a long time, but you're a Montrealer, and I want to talk about Canadian cuisine with you. So you have written about a quarter of a century about food, and you've traveled everywhere. So talk to me about how you think the rest of the world looks at us and how they would define Canadian cuisine.
Trying to sum it up, which I've never done, there are 3 things. There's 3 levels, I think, of Canadian cuisine, if you like. One is the kind of folk level. And one of the great things about Canada is that sort of its folk traditions have stayed more intact, its ethnic traditions, than most other places. I always say, I'm been saying for 24 hours anyway, that you compare, all the Jews came out of Eastern Europe, and they brought a kind of preserved brisket with them. In England, it became salt beef, which is really quite moderate and English. In America, it became pastrami, which is wildly overspiced and indistinguishable from a hot dog. Canada became smoked meat, which is the perfect marriage of the savory and the simple. And I think that's true about a lot of Canadian ethnic food. So we have that level of ethnic excellence that keeps a lot of its integrity, that doesn't tend to get as muddled, for good or ill, with other things. Somebody once said to me, the great thing about Canada is we're such a big country that you don't ever have to be too near the people you hated in the old country, right? And you keep those things intact. Iceland, my wife comes from a Winnipeg Icelandic background, and all of those things, Winnipeg Lake, Goldeye, all of the Icelandic traditions they keep intact. That's the folk level of Canadian cooking. Then there's the next level, which is Canada's incredible access to wonderful, good food. I had a dish of Lake Erie pickerel just a couple of nights ago, and it was terrific. Lake Erie pickerel will compare with any lake fish in France or Europe. So we have access to that. And finally, I think, for the first time, one of the requirements for a great cuisine is great wine, great local wine. You gotta have good local wine to have good cuisine. You can import it, right, but it never quite catches in the same way. That's why France and Italy, Hungary, all have great cuisines, and in Asia, why, we have local beer and sake and all of those things make it work. And for the first time, we're getting great Canadian wine. I guess it's one of, if you can say such a thing without being sacrilegious, a good effect of global warming is that we're getting better and better Canadian wine, great white wines, the greatest sweet wine in the world, Canadian ice wine, and even for the first time, good red wines here in Ontario. And that, I think, is the final breakthrough. You cannot have great local cooking unless you have great local wine, and now we do.
You called it Canadian smoked meat. I'm stuck on that because what you're really saying is Montreal.
Well, I'm a Montrealer, and though I recognize that my hometown has ceded its political and its economic primacy to this good great town of Toronto that we're in now, I still think that Montreal is the cultural capital of Canada and that cuisine is part of that.
Okay, given that you've laid down the gauntlet, Montreal is the best, what's the quintessential Montreal dish?
Well, all those good things we talked about, but if there's one thing that I think is better in Montreal than anything else in the world, is that the Montreal bagel remains the greatest bread produced on earth, taking into account Indian naans and French baguettes and everything else. I would rather have a Montreal bagel, if I were Jacques Decoeur, than anything else. It's sweet and yet chewy, it's densely seeded and yet adaptable to anything you put on it. The Montreal bagel.
Your U.S. immigration guy, when you go back to days, might not let you in for saying things like that.
You know what? If I had to choose between America and lying about the primacy of the Montreal bagel, I would choose the Montreal bagel.
Okay, when you go home to Montreal, where do you go get your bagels?
Well, I like Fairmount, which is a little bit unorthodox because Saint-Viateur is, of course, the great center. I think that they're on a white sesame bagel in Fairmount would be my top. But you know what? You can't really get a bad bagel at either place. And the one thing is you need them hot. That's the top of the top. And of course, the funny thing is now when I go back, talking about ethnic Canada, right? The people working in those bakeries, when I was a kid, they were Holocaust survivors. They were immigrant Jews. Not a bit now. They're Haitians and they're North Africans and so on. And that ability to keep alive a tradition from over there here by bringing in new ethnic energy. I think that's one of the things that makes Canada great.
Okay, most people think that the host has control of the show. I don't. I have an executive producer who's just sent me a message in my ear saying, we have to go Adam because he's a Montrealer and his favorite bagel is from a place I think called Saint-Viateur.
Saint-Viateur, yes.
Right, so he says enough with Adam Gopnik. He can eat his bagels
on his own. No, I said
Saint-Viateur
and Fairmount are the two temples of the, well, it's like the Flore and the Dumagot in Paris. The two great cafes. They're both perfectly fine.
Okay, he's not running the show. I am. Just before I let you go, tell me about the most memorable meal that you've ever had, good, bad, or ugly.
Most memorable meal I've ever had, and I didn't write about it in the book, oddly enough, but is in 1990, for a variety of reasons, going through a difficult time. This happens in life. And my wife and I decided to sort of run away to Paris. This is before kids. And we went to a little restaurant, now sadly gone, called Le Petit Zinc. And we sat in a little table under the stairs, which is the only one they had. And we had a big platter of langoustines and hot apple tart after, and a half bottle of Sancerre. Simplest meal you could have. And at the end of that meal, I knew it was going to be okay. I knew that life would go on fine. And I will never forget that emotion. coming in, sitting down in a state of agitation and doubt, and leaving in a state of reassurance. And it was my wife who was the deliverer of that reassurance, but it was the meal that was the vehicle that let her deliver it. That was of all the meals I've ever eaten, that's the most memorable.
It's a lovely story. This is a lovely book. I've been telling people
Thank
it's
you.
a great summer read for them. It's a great read anytime, but it's a lovely summer read. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for coming in. Thank you for coming back home.
It's been a wonderful time talking.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.